Let me share my screen first. Hopefully it will work out. I'm hoping that you can see.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. Hello again, everyone. And I want to thank Lisa and Allah for inviting me today, and I'm very happy to be a part of this great series. Today's talk is inspired by a recent research I have been conducting on underground magazines published by Soviet emigre artists during 1970s, but it was mainly shaped during my PhD dissertation research on an underground artist circle residing in Soviet Moscow. They had been active between late 1960s until the dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991, and they were named Moscow Nonconformist Artists. And as an architectural historian, my research focused on their art, exhibition practices, and exhibition places. Today, I will mostly talk about underground publications and the case of IS specifically. However, I think it's important to firstly understand the dynamics and practices of underground artists of Soviet 1960s onward. Referred to as underground artists, nonconformists, unofficial artists, and even dissidents, these group of artists actively practiced and exhibited conceptual art in their communal rooms in big cities of Soviet Union from late 1960s until the dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991. However, when speaking of an alternative art, I think we should acknowledge its context, the vast culture of socialist realism, which over the course of 60 years dominated the cultural landscape of the former Soviet Union. Socialist realism evoked not only an artistic style, but also a set of institutional structures and practices of the Soviet art world, including the system of state patronage. It all started by the decree of the Central Committee of All Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, dated 1932, when all creative associations were disbanded in the USSR. As a consequence, different unions of artists were formed at various times, both in the Soviet Union and in the autonomous republics. Following this decree, the Moscow Regional Union of Artists was created, also later named as MOSHK, in 1983. Under MOSH, numerous art groups were united under a single creative union. Together with the officialization of the museum and the lending of the design, content, and curatorial decisions of the exhibitions to the central state administrations, these decrees brought a new term to the art scene, that is state patronage. Soviet official artists produced and exhibited art for the state. Moreover, even when a particular artist was chosen to display their work in a museum, all aspects of that artist's work, from the production process to final exhibition displays, were subject to Union of Artists control and processed through its various sub-institutions. These highly complicated hierarchical schemes formed the necessary web of support for the nation's totalitarian system. Even under the relative freedom of Khrushchev's Tau from 1950s onward, Union of Artists remained the sole mechanism of control of artistic practices in Soviet Union. As was the case across the Soviet Union, the Union of Artists held the power to determine and assign the right to practice art properly in state-sanctioned places and museums. However, in that brief intermediate state of relaxed censorship, an underground alternative art circle began flourishing all over Soviet Union during late 1960s. The birth of underground art made it possible to practice and exhibit art unofficially without a mechanism of state control, therefore significantly expanding the ranks of those who might practice and exhibit art at all. Among those underground organizations were the Moscow Nonconformist Artists, a group of conceptual artists who were active in the Moscow underground scene between late 1960s until 1991. Nonconformism is defined as a lack of orthodoxy in thoughts or beliefs according to the Oxford English Dictionary. However, it has been redefined by historians to refer to the Soviet underground movement of the late 1960s. Originally used to refer to the Soviet dissident intellectuals and movement, the term nonconformist was later appropriated as a title for underground artists by Margarita Tupitsin to define their status as artists who practice outside of the official lexicon. These artists formed their own institutions that redefined the norms of and places for exhibiting art in the Soviet context throughout their long history spanning 3 decades. The artists of nonconformist circle actually made several attempts to be included or at least tolerated by the art authorities within the Union of Artists during 1960s. Before they start looking for alternative places of exhibit. An example of which is the well-known Manege exhibition dated 1962. And the exhibition actually ended with then leader of Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, visiting the exhibition and scolding the young unofficial artists and threatening the famous sculptor Ernst Niesvesny. In search of an audience to show their works and an acceptance that they will not be admitted to any museums in Soviet Union, the artists even tried to organize an open-air exhibition at the outskirts of Moscow that is dated 1974, which this exhibition was later remembered as the bulldozer exhibition because it ended up being raided by bulldozers and KGB agents, destroying the artworks and arresting several artists present there. Following these two major incidents, the artists came up with a very particular and alternative way of exhibiting. Since the artists did not have permanent exhibition spaces, the underground art exhibits of the time always had this transient character. Artists used their own apartments to put on exhibitions, and expectedly, these exhibitions were temporary. They did not have the necessary means to store the artwork, so they usually ended up destroying them. Since there were no other channels and institutions to collect and publish their work, artists took the responsibility to document and circulate their own works among other unofficial artists, as the practice of self-publishing became the only permanent way of preserving the artworks, or at least the records of them. Therefore, self-documenting and self-publishing became the only prominent way of preserving artworks. Very soon, the practice of self-publishing became a genre on its own. At this point, I would like to talk about self-publishing and how it actually ended up being a practice, an artistic practice. The history of printed media in Soviet Union is very similar to the history of art institutions in terms of state control and censorship over the produced material. Soviet state dictated a very strict control on censorship policy on the published material within the Union's borders. Glavlit, the main administration for the protection of state secrets in the press, was working under the Council of Ministers of the USSR. It was the head organization responsible for the control of all materials published in the USSR, and it maintained a branching network of local divisions down to the regional level. Established in 1922 and working as a subordinate to the Secretary of Propaganda, Glavlit was responsible for the overall leadership of the entire system of censorship, with the purpose of preventing publications of information that could compromise state secrets in books, newspapers, and other printed matter. The control over the written materials was carefully done by regional branches before anything goes into printing. It was not unusual for writers to be rejected almost immediately, to wait for years for their materials to be published, or even the printed materials being removed from circulation because the tides were often turned in Soviet Union, and becoming an enemy of the people is like a very regular and usual thing for intellectuals. The main organ responsible for publishing the state accepted materials and distribution of the printed media approved by Glavlit was named Gosizdat, also known as the state publishing house of the Soviet Union. In the art scene for underground artists, it was equally impossible to publish in the printed media as to exhibit in the state-sanctioned museums. Unable to reach out any sort of audience besides each other, unofficial artists took the matter of publishing into their hands, as they did with the exhibiting. They started publishing and distributing their own journals and magazines. They turned themselves into their own critics, theoreticians, and archivists, as they lacked an editor. As they were denied access to any audience, they became both the publishers and the readers of their own self-published printed media. Therefore, the Soviet unofficial printed media itself became a significant topic of research, in my opinion at least. In nonconformist tradition, there were two types of unofficial printed media. One is the samizdat, unapproved material produced or reproduced unofficially in the Soviet Union. And the second one is tamizdat, works also denied approval by the official censor, but published abroad and smuggled back into the Soviet Union. I would like to briefly talk about samizdat. the Russian neologism samizdat coined to describe the system of underground publishing in the post-Stalinist Soviet Union. It has entered many languages as a way to describe any clandestine production and circulation of texts. The original Soviet samizdat seems both a known and an unknown phenomenon for the Western intelligentsia. Previous international audiences most often thought of samizdat in terms of political opposition and heroic dissidence. Samizdat was a free channel for communicating the truth that will bring down the great Soviet empire. The idealized characterization made a compelling Cold War political narrative. However, it has a little current relevance when it comes to Soviet samizdat. In fact, samizdat was a more complex cultural phenomenon for Soviet intellectuals because it worked as a binder for one dissident to another, one Soviet emigre to another. Samizdat existed as a system of underground publication in the Soviet Union from the 1950s to the late 1980s. Poet Nikolai Glaskov reportedly first used the term samizdat in Russian stand for self and publish on his own unpublished manuscripts in 1952. This use of the word gave the inspiration to the now commonly used word samizdat. Moreover, since the very beginning, samizdat derived its identity from its parodic difference from official publishing. Therefore, the underground intellectuals enjoyed the ring of the word samizdat, as it sounds almost like a parody version of the word gosizdat, which is the state publishing house. It is true that samizdat self-consciously aped serious censored publications and in a way challenged the Soviet publishing industry's self-proclaimed monopoly on truth. Samizdat publications also provided a channel for freely transmitting content. However, the history of the samizdat was much more complicated than it was depicted under the Cold War narrative. Firstly, a distinction should always be drawn between political samizdat, dissident publications mainly criticizing the Soviet system and used in the fight for human rights, and literary and artistic samizdat, which I would like to discuss today. The samizdat first introduced to the unofficial intellectual circles of Soviet Union through literary figures, actually, poets and authors. They began to type carbon copies and start circulating their editions among their other friends. The main idea here was to simply share their works that otherwise won't be published. When it was adopted by the nonconformist artists, samizdat extended the idea of artist book into new territories. This phenomenon, as artist Rima Gerlovina calls it, the samizdat art, was the journey of redefining the unofficial printed matter, not only as an archive, a medium of communicating with the audience or publicizing the artworks, but also as an art form, a form of artistic as well as self-expression, a textual museum, a depository of artwork, and actually an artwork in itself. Starting from the mid-1970s to late 1980s, nonconformist artists from different cities of Soviet Union started archiving, writing on, designing, and eventually self-publishing samizdat magazines. A remarkably successful example of this aspiration can be found in the samizdat journal series Money, designed, compiled, and published by Moscow nonconformist artists between 1985 and 1991. Money Folios was compiled by the group today known as Moscow Nonconformists, as I told you. However, back in the 1980s, the group was named after their samizdat, actually. They were known as Money Artists. Money is an acronym in English for the Moscow Archive of New Art. And it is no coincidence that in the name Artist of the Money Circle, the emphasis was placed on the archive. Since for this particular group of artists, collecting and archiving became one of the hallmarks of their practice. After years of documenting and archiving artworks and exhibitions, the first samizdat of Moscow unofficial artists was released under the name of Money in 1985. The Money Folios became the first crucial collective publication of the Moscow conceptualists, despite its run only for 5 copies. The distribution process was primitively simple. After compiling photographs of the works together with the typewritten text in a portfolio, the artists circulated that folio among each other. The best artists and poets of the Moscow underground at the time took part in this unique endeavor. Although it was an archival project, it simultaneously acquired significance as a particular and significant work of art. 5 money folios were released and distributed in a limited number of copies between 1985 and 1991. Although the artist Andrei Monastyrski, you can see him on the left side here, was the chief editor of the publication who set the tone for every issue, each money folio had a different editor who collected the works, designed the outline of the samizdat, published it, and circulated the issue. However, more significantly, it made the money an artist book. It was designed by the artist, and also it was combining literary works, archival works, artistic works, or even performance activities. It was also, I think what is most important, it was a product of collective practice. While the artists in the Soviet Union, as you see, have been working on their samizdat publications, the emigre artist in the West was busy establishing networks for their counterparts abroad via using and publishing the samizdats. In the second half of the 1970s, samizdat gradually emerged as the most relevant channel in the cross-cultural exchange of ideas between the Soviet Union and the West, and thus considerably affected and changed the uniqueness of samizdat as the only medium of uncensored material published in the USSR. While in the 1950s and 60s, the circulation of texts was generally oriented from east towards west, since the works of underground artists and writers were sent abroad in order to be published. During the 1970s, the cultural transfer became less one-sided and implied a West-East axis as well, all thanks to the emigre Soviet intellectuals and their continuing efforts to publish various samizdats. In terms of the discipline of arts, nonconformist artist immigration to the West happened in two major waves. The first is between 1975 and 1980. The second is following perestroika in 1988 and 1991. During the first emigration, as far as the Western art scene concerned, nonconformist artists were individuals escaping from the Soviet Union rather than they were being a community. Therefore, it required a certain amount of time until the artists were regarded as members of a collective movement rather than individual Soviet artists. The publishing of samizdats abroad in this sense helped the recognition of Soviet underground art movement abroad, so that the nonconformist milieu had already been recognized in its totality in the West by the time the second wave of immigration arrived to the West. They were already started being recognized as a part of the movement rather than individual artists. And this is all partly and mostly thanks to the publishing of the samizdats. Because the practice of self-publishing acquired an international character during 1970s, samizdat gradually began to compete with samizdat in providing texts that were unavailable to the reader in a published form. Especially in Moscow, writers started preferring to send their works to samizdat instead of sending their works to samizdat that is more potentially is going to be staying in the Soviet Union. So they wanted more transnational audience. The author Valentina Parisi quotes from the Leningrad poet Viktor Krivulin in the accounts of Boris Ostanin and Alexander Kobak on this issue. Quote, a few years ago, Viktor Krivulin stated that samizdat journals were very likely to come soon to an end and based his prediction on what was happening at the time in Moscow, where nobody was interested anymore in such an unfashionable issue like samizdat, since everyone preferred to send his texts for publication abroad to Ann Arbor or to Aya. An excellent example of ever-increasing role played by samizdat by the end of the 1970s was Aya. Aya was published in Paris from 1979 to 1987, thanks to the efforts of its editor-in-chief, the sculptor Igor Shalkovsky, who left the Soviet Union in 1976 and moved to France and then settled in Elancourt. Igor Shalkovsky started working Aya in 1977 when he was in Paris. The samizdat was an autonomous initiative taken by Shalkovsky and the photographer Sidorov, Alexander Sidorov, who headed the Moscow editorial board of the samizdat, unofficially, obviously. However, the idea of publishing a nonconformist art abroad was born long before Shalkovsky's emigration. It is important to follow, I think, Shalkovsky's journey first to understand the story of Aya and the immediate urge for the artists to document, preserve, and publish the works outside of the Soviet Union. Igor Shalkovsky was born in 1937 And he was coming from a family what Soviet state called as enemy of the people. His father, a journalist and an editor for a local Communist Party newspaper, was arrested and executed before he was born, just before he was born. His mother was arrested soon after he was born and was sent to exile. Tsiolkovsky had lived with his grandmother in a communal flat in Moscow until he enrolled to Nisai, Surkov Art Institute of Moscow. And there he was acquainted with Igor Makarevich, Leonid Sokov, Gerlovin, Srima, and Valery Gerlovin, Sergei Shablavin, and Elena Elagina. This group of people later formed a group, well-known nonconformist artists around Moscow. And Tsiolkovsky liked to call this group as the Creative Circle of Seven. The group tried to organize, this Creative Circle of Seven tried to organize a series of collective display of works in the workshop of Leonid Sakov. They like to call this exhibition series spring exhibitions, and they tried to organize it in 1975, 1 year before Tsiolkovsky emigrated to France. However, the first exhibition of the series in Sokov's apartment stayed open for 3 days until KGB agents came and took Sakov for questioning. As a result, Sokov lost his membership in the Union of Artists, and soon after he emigrated to New York. In hindsight, I think this raid must have been one of the important turning points for Tsiolkovsky in his decision to emigrate and seek transnational support for publicizing Soviet nonconformist artists and their artworks have a relatively objective audience who are not bound with state dogmas. Rima and Valery Gerlovin, two of the other artists in the Creative Circle of Seven, state that Tsiolkovsky's intentions of establishing a printed medium in the West was originally formed during a reading session in their apartment, actually in 1975, following Sokov's call on KGB. Because of the increasing pressures on nonconformist artists in the second half of the 1970s, especially after the Bulldozer exhibition, and when an opportunity showed itself, Igor Tsiolkovsky emigrated to Europe. His emigration to France was mainly made possible as a result of the efforts of Denis Chevalier, an artist and an art critic from France, and also Swiss businessman Jack Melkonian. Tsiolkovsky actually first immigrated to Switzerland in 1976 and then sought political asylum from France and finally settled there. Upon moving to France, Chevalier helped Tsiolkovsky to build his workshop. In the historical Knights Templar, the monastery later transformed into an art institution where artists can work and exhibit. In this workshop, Tsiolkovsky started editing, binding, and publishing Aya. Meanwhile, Jack Melkonian, together with Paris gallerist Diana Vierny, financed the publication of Aya. The first issue of Aya was published in 1979 and followed by 6 other issues. The 7 issues of the dual language journal, published in both Russian and English, were entirely devoted to the situation of Russian unofficial visual arts. The main aim of the magazine was to publicize Soviet unofficial art abroad to overcome the complete isolation in which nonconformist artists found themselves in the late 1970s. As one of the artists from nonconformist scene, Igor Makarevich pointed during an interview, quote, Aya was founded by artists who wanted to be critically evaluated. Although the articles published in Aya were mostly written by art critics and theoreticians, it would not have been come to life without the contributions of the artists themselves, who sent Tsiolkovsky a wide array of materials that today represent the largest source of information about the independent cultural milieu in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. Aya was mostly formed of materials that were smuggled from the USSR by the artists, who were enthusiastic to contribute to the magazine with texts and photographs about their works. During the 7 years of its often troubled existence, Aya put up with the deficiencies of the situation for artists in the Soviet Union, and at the same time provided authors with the rare opportunity for a mirroring effect, the opportunity to publish in a journal that would reach the transnational audience, that would increase their self-awareness as a collective and a community by exposing them to the evaluation of scholars from their fields who are not operating under a totalitarian rule. Igor Makarevich explains this as, quote, before Aya, Russian intellectual art was based on kitchen talks and discussion clubs in ateliers and in private spaces. In the magazines, we were confronted with an objective phenomenon. The art process was channeled into a textual space that marked the difference between internal and objective perception. It was sort of a miracle to see your own work printed on the glossy paper. The Western press greeted the magazine with enthusiasm and benevolence. Articles appeared in many of the world's largest newspapers, such as the New York Times, Le Monde, Liberation, and in art magazines from the American Art Forum to the French Channel. The less known of unofficial artists of Moscow were an exciting team and was most welcomed by these newspapers. However, this does not mean that the aesthetics of new artists were immediately evaluated as something independent and significant by the Western press. Instead, the first issue aroused bewilderment and curiosity about the artists. It took a long time and a few issues to turn the curiosity into recognition and more profound interest. Before Aya, Soviet nonconformist artists could only access to Western art and were able to form opinions about it through reproductions of art journals that were smuggled into the country. Since until Perestroika, the traveling rules were very strict throughout Soviet Union, and the only people who were allowed in the country were either scholars, journalists, or diplomats. They were the ones smuggling these issues, reproductions of issues, to the Soviet Union. Aya did not only host the nonconformist artworks, Tsiolkovsky also invited guest artists for interviews, Western art critics to write on art, and edited the magazine so that Soviet nonconformist artworks are published side by side with their Western counterparts. As Aya was not only distributed in Europe and even was shipped to the States, it was also smuggled back to the Soviet Union by photographer Sidorov. Therefore, on top of providing the Soviet artists recognition in the West, Tsiolkovsky aimed Aya to represent, in his words, quote, a new step in our self-estimation and self-cognition, unquote. The artist's status progressively reached to a counterpart, to their Western counterparts, from being non-existent. Aya was an exhaustive survey on Soviet unofficial arts. It was inclusive of different genres that the artists are pursuing at the time. Even the title of the magazine reflected the mindset of Tsiolkovsky. A and Ya are respectively the first and last letters of the Russian alphabet, which represents the programmatically pluralistic character of the magazine. As Tsiolkovsky pointed out in an interview, we wanted to cover as many artists as possible. Aya had to be a crossroad, a meeting place of the most different movements and groups. Focusing on widely different genres, from conceptual art in Moscow to metaphysical paintings by Schwarzman, from the colorful and irreverent new wave of apt art to Francisco Infante's land art, Tsiolkovsky's journal imposed a certain order on the chaotic network of ideas fluttering in the air from the late 1970s to the beginning of Perestroika, leading to the first systematic survey on Soviet unofficial art. Even though the artists did not always enjoy to be clustered around under one big nonconformist umbrella, I think Aya was very successful opening and presenting all the colors within the nonconformist movement individually and independently. The magazine, although opened so many channels for the artists emerged in the 1970s, it also caused some controversies. The first and the most serious one affected the artists that was still reside in the Soviet Union at the time. Although the sole purpose of the magazine was to create an artistic product and not to be referred to as a dissident publication, the increasing interest from the Western media got nonconformist artists in Moscow into trouble with the authorities. Tsiolkovsky states, quote, after the first issue, many were summoned to the KGB, but at first they were completely polite conversations. Following that incident, the later issues were opened with the statement, materials of authors who are in the USSR are printed without their knowledge. However, this statement was not enough, as in 1985, Igor Tsiolkovsky was officially denaturalized. While the artists in the Soviet Union had been having troubles with the authorities because of Aya, in the West, shocked to realize that this new journal devoted to Russian visual arts, edited in Paris, offered no place for old masters such as Ilya Repin or Isaac Levitan. The pre-war Russian immigrant conservative milieu strongly criticized Aya. At that time, it was not unusual to come across frictions between the Soviet immigrant intellectuals from the pre-war area who were immigrated before 1950s and the newcomer immigrants that were immigrated after 1970s. Since the old masters, who claimed their territories as political dissidents in the West, were often troubled by these newcomers because they think that newcomers were either apolitical or too laid back. The first Soviet immigrants often accused of their younger compatriots to abandon the cultural values of the Great Russia and to be assimilated by Western culture. The controversy which Aya was involved was in a similar fashion. It was flared up mainly because well-known artist of the pre-war Soviet immigrants, Alexander Glazer, had already been publishing a Tamizdat named The Third Way, in English named The Third Way, was based in France. In a piece written for the New York Tamizdat newspaper Novaya Gazeta in 1980, Glazer did not hesitate to define Aya as a sectarian edition, since it was uncritically supporting the new trends in unofficial art without filtering them whatsoever. In his polemical answer to Glazer, Tsiolkovsky protested against Glazer's attempt to present himself as the only referent in the West for Soviet unofficial art. Although following Glazer, many other old masters and older Tamizdats criticized Aya and Tsiolkovsky's position to be indifferent to the war against the totalitarian enemy that is the Soviet Union. Aya's mission was not to reject the Soviet reality or fighting to go back to pre-revolutionary past. The main aim of the magazine was to introduce Russian hidden art, in Tsiolkovsky's words, Russian hidden art to the West, and to assist the consolidation of nonconformist artists. In fact, nonconformist art in itself was a critique of Soviet official art. Instead of rejecting Soviet reality, nonconformist artists took on a mission to comment on it. More importantly, report on it through art. Many artworks of nonconformist genre were mockeries of Soviet totalitarian art or Soviet everyday life. Although Tsiolkovsky and the magazine often involved in controversies, not only with the authorities, but with the emigre community in the West too. And Aya ceased to exist in 1986. To this day, it is still one of the most important archives of nonconformist art and artists, especially for artists who were still residing at the Soviet Union at the time and were unable to exhibit. The magazine was considered as a substitute for exhibitions. One of the artists, Alexander Kosolapov, stated in an interview, quote, "For us, the magazine is like a gallery," end quote. Aya took on a very difficult mission to build an audience for the younger generation of Soviet artists and was successful in it too. Most of the artists in the circle later emigrated to the West, following perestroika in 1988, and by then they were well-known figures in the West, thanks to the efforts of Aya and Tsiolkovsky and similar Tamizdat that were publicizing about them long before their immigration. With this final remark, I would like to finish the talk here. If you have any questions, I am delighted to talk about unofficial art, unofficial printed media, or anything else. Thank you again, Lisa and Allah, for having me. It was very, very great experience for me, and I hope it was great experience for anyone who's listening. Thank you.